Good morning, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome to United Israel World Union. This is our Sabbath morning scripture study coming to you live from St. Francisville, Louisiana. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm excited about today's class, as I am about every class. So again, we appreciate you joining us today. We are on a journey through the text of the Pentateuch, and we're following roughly the annual cycle of readings that are found within most Jewish congregations, whereby we read through the 5 books generally attributed to the hand of Moses in a calendar year. So we are in that process. This is class 5. We're in Torah portion, or the Pentateuch portion, number 4. This week. It's called Va-Yera. So we're in the book of Genesis, the book of beginnings, Bereshit as it is called in Hebrew, or Genesis as it is in English by way of Greek. So again, following this annual cycle. If we followed the annual cycle of readings and, we were looking at how many does it take, how many of these parashahs or parashot does it take to get through the book of Genesis, it would be 12. So if you realize that we're going to be doing this for a total in 12 weeks, we'll work through the entirety of the book of Genesis. Now, if we were following the triennial cycle, the 3.5-year cycle of readings, Bereshit or Genesis contains 45, and we've done this before, where we spent 45 weeks, almost a year, just working on the book of Genesis. So, but again, we are in class 5 of our series, and this week is part 2 of a 3-part mini-series on the life of Abraham, which is contained within a collection of stories from various ancient sources. We're going to be talking a lot over the next several weeks and months and the next year on sources. And so this particular story within the story that we're working on about the life of Abraham was assembled by someone using different sources at the person's disposal into a work that was called Ele Toledot Torah. These are the bringings forth, or these are the generations of Torah. And what that is, really, at its core, is the story of Abraham, because the Ele Toledot Torah begins in Genesis chapter 11 and verse 27, and it runs all the way to chapter 25 of Genesis, verse 11. And within that, what we get is at the beginning, the birth of Abraham is announced. And at the end of Ele Toledot Torah, the story ends with the death of Abraham. So you begin with the birth of Avram, you end the story with the book of Abraham. This underlying story within the story is really about Abraham. So it takes 3 classes to cover that if we're following the annual cycle of readings. Now, all told, Avraham, as he has come to be known, lives 175 years. So we're dealing with these chapters from the book of Genesis are really covering 175 years of history. Now, this 175 years can be neatly arranged or divided even further, and it is, in terms of the life of Abraham. So when you take 175 and the scribe or the final compiler, the redactor, the person who pulled all this together, is dealing with 7 periods of 25 years within the life of Abraham. So if you think about it, this is the way that it was arranged. You have 3 of those 25-year periods are in Mesopotamia. We talked about that last week. We did the map. Because it is Abraham, or Abram at the time, is 75 years old when he leaves Haran. So the first 3 of 7 periods of 25 years are the Abram who is from Mesopotamia. We talked about last week, is it from Haran? Is he from Ur of the Chaldees? You know, we have these different sources that give us differences in that respect. Now, after he leaves Haran in the 75th year, we get that from Genesis chapter 12. It very clearly says, and he was 75 years when he left Haran, so we've got markers. Now, when the text provides those markers, we're in a good place to make those determinations. Other times in the text, we don't get the details we need to be certain. What I'll do is I'll make sure I tell you, this we know, and here's how we know it. This we're not so sure because we're not given that information. I don't want to cross that line where I'm speculating where the information is lacking. But in this case, he then goes to the land of Canaan, and he spends 25 years, roughly 24, 25 years, without the promised son. Let's go ahead and call it 25 because he's 75 when he leaves Haran. When Isaac is born, we will read that he is 100 years old, 25 years, okay? And then you get to the last section, which is a period after you cross that fourth period of 25 years. He's 100 years old. You have the 75 final years of Abraham's life, okay? So you kind of see there's a little structure within the structure, a little order within the text, and we can follow that along and we can look at the life of Abraham in pieces. Now, as you know, most of what we know from the life of Abraham takes place after those first 75. We don't know a lot about Abraham when he is in Mesopotamia. The little bit that we get from the text of the Bible primarily comes from Joshua chapter 24. And all it tells us there is that Abraham is from a family of idolaters. Now again, we've kind of touched on this. There are legends and myths about how he smashed idols in the idol shop and all that, but that's not in the Bible. Now somebody might say, well, we believe that story is true. Well, okay, but it's just not in the Bible, is my main point. Now, the material that we're going to cover today, in today's class, is really the second, being that it's the second of the third in the class, kind of brings us into that transition point when Abram is 99 and 100. In other words, we're going to cover the text in a single year, basically, okay? So what we do know, let me go ahead and establish the time frame for you. We know from Genesis chapter 18 that Abram is 99 and Sarah is 90. These are givens. And then if you look with me, this parashah ends at the end of chapter 22 of Genesis. So I'm just going to set a boundary in terms of time. Look at chapter 23, and I'm reading from the JPS here. Sarah's lifetime, the span of Sarah's life, came to 127 years, okay, and then she dies. So next week's class, we begin with Sarah at the age of 127. So what that means is that the period of time that we're covering is less than, or it can't be greater than 37 years. You follow me? Because she's 90 at the beginning, she's 127 when we begin the next cycle. So assuming that 18 through chapter 23 are chronological, if that's true, then we're dealing with a period within a window of 37 years. Now, all of this is important because I want to show you how we're going to focus in within that 37 years on a very specific time in today's class. And we're going to do that because the editor, the final redactor, did that, and that's the way they wanted us to read this, okay? So they want to draw our attention, they want to draw our focus, and we're going to allow that to happen. Why? Because we want to follow the biblical story as it came together. So really, if chapters 18, 19, 20, and 21, as we work through the material, you will see that all of that takes place according to the text in a single year. One single significant, and I might add, busy year in the life of Abraham, which spans 175 years. Okay? So, by the way, we can include chapter 17 in this. So really we're dealing with 17, 18, 19, 20, and 21 in this 1 year. Look with me at Genesis chapter 17. I always like to kind of frame things up so that the evidence is put before you. Genesis 17 says, when Abram was 99 years old, okay? So 17 begins when he's 99, and we get other dates along the way that indicate that it's still a year. Look at so that's 17. Now look at chapter 21 and verse 5. 21 and verse 5 says, now Abram was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. So you follow my point. I want to tell you that from 17 through 21 is 1 year. Now chapter 22 is a little bit less helpful in terms of dating. It's a little bit less clear. It's a little ambiguous. We don't know for certain. This is what I was saying. So if you look at chapter 22 and verse 1, the JPS says sometime afterward. In Hebrew, it's achar hadvarim ha'ele. And after these words, or after these things. Well, that doesn't really give us an exact, it just says, and after this, so we don't get what we get in some of these other texts. And Abram was this old, or Sarah was this age. It's a little less specific. And you'll find that. I'm going to point some things out today and throughout this series where I show that certain texts, certain sources are less specific. Others are very, very detailed in what they present to us. Look at verse 20 of chapter 22 for another example. Chapter 22, verse 20 says, the JPS says sometime later, all right? Kind of vague. In the Hebrew, again, it's actually the same phrase that's found in verse 1. Akar hadvarim ha'ele, and after these things. That phrase is used quite a few times. It's 12 times that it's used in Scripture. And that exact phrase, Achar hadvarim ha'ele, and after these things. Again, not specific. So what we are dealing with, and the reason I'm going into this much detail, is to frame up and give us a frame of reference so that you can see just how much focus the biblical writer places on 1 year. 1 year in a life of 175 years. And it makes you wonder, what happened in the other 174, right? How could you capture, if you said, we're going to write a history of your life, but we're only going to use 1 year, which one do you want? Now, there are a few years that I'd say, don't use that one. Let's not use that one. Let's use, and you pick. But this is really important. So what we have is we have 5 chapters that cover the events that take place in this year. And I had help with the math, but it's 1/2 of 1% of the life of Abraham. 1 year. All right, that's where we're going to be focused. And by the way, a lot happens in this life, in this 1 year of the life. And when I say a lot happens, I don't intend the pun, although lot does play into the story. So a lot happens, and Lot is part of this 1 year that we get in this real focus. Now, We're going to be talking about sources. Now, let me say this, even though we've covered a little bit of this in previous classes, I want to say this before we get started. The Bible as we have it, and you'll be made more, I think, you'll be more convinced as we work through this, that there are different sources. I've mentioned a couple of books that I really appreciate over time, and these are about, this one is called A Synoptic Harmony of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. A synoptic harmony, meaning that one source in, say, Samuel is put side by side with another source telling the same story, and you can compare. Clearly two different sources, sometimes three, sometimes more. This one is called A Harmony of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. What this tells us, what this shows us, is that the sources that we have come from different hands. They provide different evidences that prove it's not the same source. So like you go, well, who wrote Chronicles? Because it says this, and this about this particular king. But when we look at Kings, it paints this king a little bit differently. There are cases where Samuel and Kings, or Chronicle and Kings, when you compare them side by side about a particular monarch, that if you read one, you'd say, well, that sounds like a decent person. You read another, it sounds like it's horrible. Let me give you the example. I was talking to Mark this morning. It's like Fox and CNN, and I'm not going to get political, but they're different. If you had the transcript, let's say this year is going into some history book, and the compiler of that history is going to collect sources from transcripts from CNN and Fox. Now, I know some of you out there are going, ooh, I wouldn't even read this one, or I'd read that one, or I use One America Network, or whatever. Don't go there. My point being that if you combine these sources, then 2,000 years later, somebody reads it and they'll say, whoever this person was, he was the worst political person ever. And another would say, no, it says right here he's the best. You see? So then you're faced thousands of years later with which source is true. Well, we have both. We have both, and we have to look at these sources and we have to try to derive from them, is everything that this source says representative of the actual person, or is the other source? Or are they both a little bit, you have to kind of pull the truth from both of them. Okay, sources exist within the biblical text. That's my point. We're going to go through quite a few of them, and we're going to hit this out of the gate. So, I want to tell you this morning that chapter 17 and chapter 18 both contain an announcement that Sarai is going to bear a son for Abraham. Chapter 17 tells us that, and chapter 18 tells us that. Now remember, 17, 18, 19, 20, and 21 are all in the same year. So the question becomes, is 17, this announcement of Sarai bringing forth a son for Abraham, is that, because it supposedly happens, and then you have 18, assuming they're chronological, are these both accounts from the same hand? That's the question. Are we ready? And everyone says yes, amen. Okay, I'm going to read from the JPS. I don't need a lot of linguistic help with this, so we're going to just go with this translation here. Go with me to chapter 17 of Genesis, and I'm going to put you onto this. Look at verse 15, Genesis 17, 15. And God said to Abraham, as for your wife Sarai, You shall not call her Sarai, but her name shall be Sarah. I will bless her indeed. I will give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she shall give rise to nations. Rulers of people shall issue from her. Abraham threw himself on his face and laughed as he said to himself, can a child be born to a man 100 years old, or can Sarah bear a child at 90? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live by your favor. God said, nevertheless, Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son. You shall call him Isaac, and I will maintain my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring to come. As for Ishmael, I've heeded you. I hereby bless him. I will make him fertile and exceedingly numerous. He shall be a father of 12 chieftains, and I will make him of him a great nation. My covenant I will maintain with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this season next year. And when he was done speaking with him, God was gone from Abraham. Okay, look at chapter 18 now. We're going to read them both, and then we're going to break it down. Verse 9, chapter 18, verse 9. They said to him, where is your wife Sarah? And he replied, there in the tent. Then one said, I will return to you next year, and your wife Sarah shall have a son. Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent, which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. Sarah had stopped having the periods of women. And Sarah laughed to herself, saying, now that I am withered, am I to have enjoyment with my husband so old? Then the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I in truth bear a child old as I am? Is anything too wondrous for the Lord? I will return to you at the same season next year, and Sarah shall have a son. Sarah lied, saying, I did not laugh, for she was frightened. But he replied, you did laugh. Okay. Join me next week? No. Okay. So here we go. We have two stories, and we read these consecutive. We read these as separate accounts. And what I want to do is look at, just for the sake of looking, at some of the interesting things within both of these stories. Okay? We have in both stories an announcement to Abraham that Sarah, his wife, is going to bring a son, right? Both stories. In chapter 17, Sarah's not there. He's talking to Abraham. He gives him the story. He announces the birth of Isaac. Even talks about the name Isaac. You know, you'll call him this name and so forth. Now, chapter 18 also has a story that tells of an announcement to Abraham about the birth of Isaac by Sarah. You say, so what? Stick with me. Laughter follows the announcement in chapter 17. It says Abraham laughs to himself, right? And then in the story in chapter 18, laughter follows the announcement about the birth. But in 18, Sarah is there. She's listening. She hears. The announcement is still to Abraham, but she hears it. In this one, she laughs to herself. Interesting. Now, where am I going with this? Here we go. In 17, the language about Abraham laughing to himself, in Hebrew it says, belibo, in his heart. So he laughs to himself, and he's doing this on the inside. You know, it's not like but it does say he fell on his face in 17. He thinks this is hilarious. You know, he's 99. His wife is 100. All right. Now, he's not rebuked for laughing. There's no rebuke. But in chapter 18, Sarah, she's listening in, and it says that she laughed, but a different word is used. In this one, it doesn't say she laughed in her heart. It says she laughed bechir ba, within herself. Again, though, it's an inner laughter. Now, she doesn't fare so well as Abraham. Abraham is like, he laughs and there's no mention of it. But when Sarah laughs, the Lord said to Abraham, why is she laughing? Right? These are just interesting things. We'll get into this more and more and more over the class. Verse 13 and 14 of this chapter, it says that the Lord says to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? And in verse 15, Sarah lied, and she said that she didn't laugh because she was scared. And then he said, yes, you did. Now, verse 17, or chapter 17, I'm doing a contrast here. So what I would like you to do is, as I work through this material today, if you have paper and pen at the house, you can follow me along. Create 2 chapters. I'm going to go through several of these stories with similarities, and you can do it in 2 columns. You know, like at the top you put 17, draw a line in the middle of the page, put 18, and you list out the things that are similar, the things that are different. Now, in 17, look at verse 17. It says, can a child be born to a man 100 years old, or can Sarah bear at 90? It's very specific on ages. But if you look at chapter 18, verse 11, now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. Both stories tell us about the age of the patriarch and the matriarch. One is very specific, one is sort of general. You're not convinced yet. But in chapter 17, our story refers to the deity as Elohim. Look at this. And God said to Abraham, verse 15. Verse 19, God said, these are Elohim, by the way. And then verse 22, and when he was done speaking, God was gone from Abraham. Now you go to 18. 18 doesn't use God. He uses the Lord. 18 is, as you work through, you'll see verse 13, then the Lord, Jehovah, said to Abraham. Verse 14, is anything too wondrous for Jehovah? Now, that's interesting, because one story tells a story and it uses certain things, like it gives us the timing, it gives us the age, or tells us specifically. Another one doesn't. One uses Elohim, one uses Jehovah. They're both telling the same story. Now, it gets deeper. Verse 21, by my covenant I will maintain with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this season next year. The timing of the birth is announced in chapter 17. In Hebrew it says, Lama'od hazeh bashema. At this, it's very specific. It's Moed is an appointed time, right? So it's giving a timing at this appointed time. Basically, in the next year, this is when it's going to happen. Now, chapter 18, verse 14 also gives the timing. I will return to you at the same season next year, and Sarah shall have a son. That one in Hebrew is Lamoed Ashuv Alecha. And it's basically, it also goes on to say, Ka'et Chaya, at this time of life, or at the time of life. So you have, interestingly enough, you have 2 stories that have much in common. And you say, well, I want you to, some people might say, well, I believe they're 2 separate events. It's not 2 sources telling the same story. They're happening in the same year, and I just want you to think about what we're going to be talking about when we look at the differences. Again, one of these stories uses the divine name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. The other source uses Elohim. Same story. Details, there are a few different details. But again, remember these books. Remember Fox and CNN. We have different sources that are telling these ancient stories, and we get the benefit of reading these as we work through. Now, one other similarity between chapter 17 and 18 is that the writer lets us in on something. I love this. We actually get on the inside of the characters. The writer lets us know. Who is the writer? Some say, well, it's Moses. Just say Moses. Whoever wrote this, whoever gave us this ancient story is a brilliant writer. They want us to feel what's going on. So we know, for instance, what Abraham is thinking on the inside. He's thinking about, I'm 100 and she's 99, she's 90. I mean, that's not verbalized, it's on the inside. It's in his heart. The writer lets us know that. Now, chapter 18, the writer lets us know what Sarah says on the inside too. She says this, now that I'm withered, am I going to have enjoyment? Especially with this old guy, right? My husband is so old. Now, 18 even takes it further than this. Not only do we get inside of the characters, Abraham and Sarah, look at chapter 18, verse 17. Now, Jehovah had said, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? Remember now, Jehovah is walking with Abraham. Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do, since Abraham is to become great and populous nation, and all the nations of the earth are to bless themselves by him? For I have singled him out that he may instruct his children and his posterity to keep the way of Jehovah by doing what is just and right, in order that Jehovah may bring about for Abraham what he has promised him. Now, is Jehovah saying that out loud where Abraham is right there? No. We're allowed inside what God is considering. It's like God saying, should I let Abraham know what I'm about to do? Abraham's not looking at him like, are you talking to me? It's inside. We get this insight. I think it's incredible. Now, this, by the way, is a very powerful text. It's when what God ultimately decides, according to Genesis 18, is, yes, I'm going to let Abraham know what I'm about to do, because he's the guy. He's the one that I'm going to use, and it's through him that all the nations of the earth will be blessed. So I have to tell him, right? And that's what happens. You know the story. So we have two stories. We have two stories about the announcement of Sarah bringing forth Isaac. They take place at the same time. Both of these are communicated. Both of these announcements are communicated to Abraham. Both give the timing of the birth, right? They're given at the same time. They give the timing of the birth. They both tell the same story, but they use different details. Who laughed and ultimately led to the naming of Isaac? Was it Abraham because he laughed? Is that why we're going to call him Isaac? Is it that Sarah laughed, even though she said she didn't, but she really did? Is that the reason we call him Isaac? We know, even whether you look at, but you say, well, both of them laughed, so the child is called double laughter or whatever. But the idea is that both of these stories contain the same elements, the same things throughout. But they have different ways of defining things. Like one is very specific on ages and timing. Abraham is this old, Sarah is this old. Another just says they're old. One of these, they both have different ways of naming the deity. In chapter 17, it's Elohim throughout. In chapter 18, it's Jehovah throughout. And remember, and don't forget, according to Exodus 6, 2, and 3, the name Jehovah was not known to Abraham. So just put that in your notes. Okay. I think that we have two accounts telling the same story, different sources, and I am thankful to God that we have both. And we're going to see quite a bit in this class today. Now, also, while we're here, look at chapter 18, verse 12. I want to show you something here. In 18:12 it says, "And Sarah laughed to herself, saying, Now that I am withered, am I to have enjoyment with my husband so old?" Remember, she says that inside. She doesn't say it out loud. Now, God's about to tell Abraham what she said. This is going to be a long night in the tent. If he tells Abraham the way that Sarah put it, Abraham's feelings might get hurt. He might say, "Oh, you're talking about how old I am?" You know, might be problematic, but it's cleaned up a little bit. Now watch this. Look at verse 13. "And Jehovah said to Abraham, Why did Sarah laugh, saying, Shall I in truth bear a child old as I am?" He doesn't tell Abraham that Sarah said he was old. You can imagine. Now, a lot of people read right over that. Did you notice that? God is telling Abraham what Sarah said, but he doesn't tell Abraham what she says. The rabbis pick up on this. I think this is funny. The Talmud explains this. It says in the Talmud, "Great is peace, for even the Holy One, blessed be He, made a change on account of it." So the rabbis comment on this, and they said that peace is so great that even God would say, "Well, here's what she said," but he doesn't tell him everything. We need somebody like that in our relationships sometimes, don't we? Because sometimes, I know some of you say things about your spouse on the inside. And you need, if it ever comes out, you need somebody to clean it up a little bit. Okay. Now, I'm going to quickly cover the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Again, this series, you know the stories. There are a lot of organizations which are teaching you the stories as you know them. We're looking at the text. We're looking at the text of the Pentateuch. We're digging deeply. You can read these stories, and I know you know them very well by heart in many ways. But the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, you know the story. I want to look at, just quickly, this idea about the intercession of Avraham. Now, people impose or superimpose their theology into all sorts of text, but it's very difficult to do in some places. Let me give you an example. When Abraham is interceding on behalf of Sodom and Gomorrah, right, he is not requesting that God destroy the wicked and save the innocent. That's not what he's doing, right? What he's doing is rather, he's asking Jehovah to forgive the entire place on behalf of the righteous. There is a big difference in that. See, a lot of people today are so all about the judgment of God, and they, with good reason, they'll say, it's not all lovey-dovey. There's some judgment that has to happen, and they want to call down fire from heaven on those that sin and don't live as holy as they are. But what Abraham is doing is something different than those folks. What Abraham's doing is saying, let me ask you this. Let's say that you find just this many righteous. Will you save the group? He's not saying go ahead and zap the bad people with lightning. That's what a lot of people in the world do. A lot of these holiness folks are about, let's zap the wicked. But look at verse 26 of chapter 18. This is in this intercession. "And Jehovah answered, If I find within the city of Sodom 50 innocent ones, I'll forgive the whole place for their sake." Wow. Now that doesn't line up with some of your theology probably. You mean to tell me, this is Jehovah speaking according to the text. He's saying if I find a group of people that are righteous, I'll save the whole group. Now, that's not the only time it appears in Scripture. So people say, yeah, but theology developed over time. Look at Jeremiah chapter 5. Jeremiah chapter 5, verse 1. Here we go. Roam the streets of Jerusalem, search its squares, look about and take note. You'll not find a man, there's none who acts justly, who seeks integrity, that I should pardon her. You see that? It's like, it's interesting that if you could find somebody, he would pardon her. Let me give you another translation. This is a little bit closer. This is the ESV. Run to and fro through the streets of Jerusalem. Look and take note. Search your squares to see if you can find a man who does justice and seeks truth, that I may pardon her. In other words, if you find that person, I'll pardon Jerusalem. Now, but we also get other texts which say, so for instance, look at Ezekiel 14. I really don't want to read the whole chapter, but look at verse 12. Ezekiel 14:12. The word of Jehovah came to me, Son of man, if a land were to sin against me and commit a trespass, and I stretched out my hand against it and broke its staff of bread and sent famine against it and cut off man and beast from it, even if these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, should be in it, they would by their righteousness save only themselves, declares Adonai Jehovah. The implication is that at the right time, in the right circumstances, according to God's directive, one righteous person or a group of righteous people can save others. Remember, Abraham, and by the way, that runs all the way, read chapter 14, 12 through 23 in your own time. But the idea is a little bit different than what people think. You know, it's like Noah is through his righteousness, his woman and his three sons and their women. We don't read how righteous they are, right? Or Lot, you know, when the Malachim show up and they say, look, get your girls, and what about these guys? Are they going? And they're laughing. They're like, there ain't nobody coming down with fire. And, you know, they laugh. They think it's funny. So they don't even go. But it's open to them on behalf of the righteousness that God recognizes, okay, that others can be brought in. And by the way, in Ezekiel, while you're there and we're talking about Sodom, look at chapter 16. I just want to mention this. You can look at it later. The prophets will do this. Isaiah chapter 1, Ezekiel chapter 16. Israel reaches such a place of degradation in their behavior and so forth, that there are times where the prophets will refer to the people of Israel as Sodom and Gomorrah, you know. And so in one of these comparisons in chapter 16, verses 46 through 50, again, this is talking about Samaria, but it's applying Sodom as the example of Samaria. So bad, it's like Sodom. So look at what the comparison is by Ezekiel. Your elder sister was Samaria, who lived with her daughters to the north of you. Your younger sister was Sodom, who lived with her daughters to the south of you. Did you not walk in their ways and practice their abominations? Why, you were almost more corrupt than they in all your ways. As I live, declares the Lord God, your sister Sodom and her daughters did not do what you and your daughters did. Only this was the sin of your sister Sodom, arrogance. She and her daughters had plenty of bread and untroubled tranquility, yet they did not support the poor and the needy. So we have a certain idea of the sin of Sodom. It usually has to do with the men of the town trying to get the Malachim out into the street to do with them as they chose, and that is no doubt a problem. But what else is there? And it looks like one of the underlying themes is this bad behavior that's exemplified in the fact that, or it's illustrated in the fact that they don't share with the poor and the needy. Okay, now, this is a bizarre story. The story of Lot's descendants. You know, at its root, we have an old man, similar to what we have it's a surprise that the old man in Genesis 18, verse 12, he's too old to have children, but yet he does. If you look at 19, Genesis 19, this same theme shows up. In 19 and verse 31, it says, and the older one, these are the two girls, they've escaped. The older one said to the younger, our father is old, and there's not a man on earth, you know. So the idea is that here we've got an old person, and yet they have children. Now, Lot's descendants are, throughout biblical history, they're pretty much the enemies of Israel. I wrote about this in my book in one of the chapters. But look at chapter 19, verse 36 through 38. Thus the two daughters of Lot came to be with child by their father. The older one bore a son and named him Moab. He is the father of the Moabites of today. And the younger also bore a son, and she called him Ben-Ami. He is the father of the Ammonites of today. Clearly anachronistic language. Someone is writing at a later point that these children are the descendants of their father, and their name indicates that. And by the way, to this day, that's a flag. When we see that phrase quite often, it indicates anachronism. And you know the definition? It means later time. It's where someone at a later time is updating the text. But Moab continues to be the enemy, if you will, of Israel. They're the outsider. Look at Deuteronomy 23, just to have this in your notes. It's really going beyond my scope here, but 23 of Deuteronomy, verse 4. No Ammonite or Moabite, these are Lot's descendants, shall be admitted into the congregation of Jehovah. None of their descendants, even to the 10th generation, shall ever be admitted into the congregation of Jehovah, because they didn't meet you with food and water on your journey after you left Egypt, and because they hired Bilam, son of Beor, from Petor of Aram Naharaim, we know that place, to curse you. Now, this particular passage is interesting, and it causes a lot of people later to do theological gymnastics to explain certain problems. All right? Remember, Ruth is a Moabitess. Now, she's married into a family, but it is still interesting because in an ironic twist, the kings of Israel, the Davidic dynasty, is part Moabite. And that, I think, is very, very interesting, that this Moabite connection finds its way into the monarchy. Now, the other thing that I would bring up is, now Solomon, we know Solomon loved him some women. 700 women, you know, like wives, and 300 concubines, I think is the way the King James puts it. He loved these foreign women, and he loved their gods too. Solomon goes off early. But one of his women is a woman by the name of Naamah, and Naamah is the mother of Rehoboam, who follows Solomon on the throne. So in 1 Kings 14:21, you'll read that Naamah is from Moab, and that's one of Solomon's women. And her child, right, Rehoboam ultimately ends up as one of the kings. Now, chapter 20. We're at chapter 20, and this to me is very interesting, especially in terms of sources. Chronologically, chapter 20 is part of the same year as chapter 17, 18, and 19, which means that Abraham and Sarah, when they journey to Gerar, are 99 and 90. Abraham is concerned that someone there is going to see his 90-year-old wife and want to take her for their woman. Now, I know I have to be careful here. I'm treading lightly. I just want you to understand that. Because I know that the demographics, I got a report that said most who listen to me are women who are a little bit older. And that's, I think, because they're spiritually mature and they're more advanced than most men. That's what I think. Excuse me, guys. You know what I'm saying. But the idea that I want to convey is that women can be beautiful into their old age. My question, though, I think a lot of people think that. They tend to read this story and they're not thinking of Sarah as 90, right? So no offense. I know some of you may be close to 90 and you're probably gorgeous. In fact, I know some of you are. Okay, just think about it. Now, Abraham devises this plan so that they don't steal Sarah for their wife. And he tells Sarah, tell them you're my sister. Now, there's quite a bit in Jewish literature where people try to defend Abraham's action here. And they come up with all sorts of genealogical musings to say, well, technically he's not lying because of the niece and this and that. And he says, you're my sister. She's not his sister. She's not his sister. And Ramban, with an N on the end, Ramban calls him out. Ramban says that Abraham inadvertently committed a great sin when he did this because he doesn't trust that God can protect his wife. Now, this isn't the first time that Abraham has used this little gig. Look at chapter 12, Genesis chapter 12. It's pretty standard when they travel. Chapter 12, look at verse 10. There was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. And they're not young here, really. I mean, young is getting further for me. She's in her late mid-60s. So that's nothing, right? But still, she's not 20. I know how a beautiful woman you are. If the Egyptians see you and think she's my wife, they'll kill me and let you live. Please say that you're my sister, that it may go well with me because of you and that I may remain alive thanks to you. Now, Abram entered Egypt. The Egyptians saw how very beautiful the woman was, and Pharaoh's courtiers saw her and praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's palace, and because of her, it went well with Avram. He acquired sheep, oxen, asses, male and female slaves, she-asses, and camels. But Jehovah afflicted Pharaoh and his household with mighty plagues on account of Sarai, the wife of Abram. And Pharaoh sent for Abram, and he said, what is this that you've done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister so that I took her as my wife? Now, here's your wife. Take her and be gone. And Pharaoh put men in charge of him, and they sent him off with his wife and all that he possessed. Jehovah afflicts Pharaoh and his household. Abram is the one that said, this is my sister. Pharaoh's messed up over this. He's like, why would you tell me that? Y'all get out of here. Now, the same thing basically happens in the case of Avimelech. Avimelech, in the story in chapter 20 of Genesis, we again have a case where Abraham and Sarah are traveling, and they're going to Gerar, all right? And look at verse 3. Verse 2, Abraham said to Sarah his wife, she is my sister, or of his wife, she is my sister. So King Avimelech of Gerar had Sarah brought to him. But God came to Avimelech in a dream by night and said to him, you are to die because of the woman that you've taken, for she's a married woman. Now Avimelech had not approached her. He said, O Lord, will you slay people even though innocent? This, by the way, sounds a lot like what Abram asked God in the story of Sodom. Shall not the judge of all the earth do justice? You going to kill the innocent? He himself said to me, she is my sister. This is Avimelech talking to God. And she also said, he's my brother. She's in on it too. When I did this, my heart was blameless and my hands were clean. Now, a lot of people would say, no, they weren't. Well, let's see what God says. And God said to him in the dream, I knew you did this with a blameless heart. And so I kept you from sinning against me. That's why I didn't let you touch her. Okay, this is interesting. But like the story of Pharaoh, he still afflicts the people. Remember, we're digging deep. We want to look at this stuff. Look at verse 17 of chapter 20. Abraham then prayed to God, and God healed Avimelech and his wife and his slave girls so that they bore children. For Jehovah had closed fast every womb of the household of Avimelech because of Sarah, the wife of Abraham. Interesting. But Avimelech was pure in this, at least according to God in the dream. Now, there's yet another story that we have to bring into the mix. We have to bring something else in. And if you look at chapter 26, verse 6 and 11, this is later. I'm going to go into more detail in a later class, but I just want to touch on it. Chapter 26, 6 through 11. So Isaac stayed in Gerar. This is not Abraham, this is Isaac. When the men of the place asked him about his wife, he said, she is my sister. For he was afraid to say my wife, thinking the men of the place might kill me on account of Rebekah, for she's beautiful. When some time had passed, Avimelech, king of the Philistines, looking out the window, saw Isaac, this translation says fondling his wife Rebekah. Avimelech sent for Isaac and said, so she's your wife? Why then did you say, she is my sister? Isaac said to him, because I thought I might lose my life on account of her. And Avimelech says, what have you done to us? One of the people might have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us. Avimelech then charged all the people, saying, anyone who molests this man or his wife shall be put to death. Now, there are a couple of interesting things here. Number one, we've got Abraham and Isaac in Gerar, different times. Avimelech is still around, or is it a different Avimelech? It could be a son. All right, it doesn't have to be. It could work. You know, the math could work, but it's the same story. It's repeating. It's like something is going on here, and you say, well, it's exactly what happened. I'm not going to argue that. I'm just saying, notice the details. So now I want to look at chapter 20 and verse 4. Chapter 20 and verse 4. Now, Avimelech had not approached her. He said, O Lord, will you slay even the innocent? He himself said, she's my sister. And she also said, he's my brother. When I did this, I was blameless and my hands were clean. And God said to him in the dream, I knew you did this with a blameless heart, so I kept you from sinning against me. That's why I didn't let you touch her. Therefore, restore the man's wife, since he is a prophet. He will intercede for you to save your life. If you fail to restore her, know that you shall die, you and all that are yours. Now that'll motivate you. So it's a pretty harsh sentence. You either restore the woman and everything's going to be all right, or I'll kill you. And so Avimelech, now notice what he says is, God says that if you do this, he's a prophet. Now, I don't want people to get... I want people to follow closely because I'm bringing up some things that textually help us to understand when certain parts were written. For instance, in Hebrew, it says that Avram or Avraham is a Navi, a prophet. Okay? And, but I want you to look with me at 1 Samuel chapter 9. 1 Samuel chapter 9. We're always looking for ways to date a text or a portion of a text. 1 Samuel 9, and I want to read verse 9. 1 Samuel 9:9. Formerly in Israel, when a man went to inquire of God, he said, "Let us go to the seer, Roe." For today's prophet, Navi, was formerly called a seer. Now, what this tells us is, in the time, by the way, this is the setting is the monarchy period. We're talking about the time of Saul. And if you interviewed somebody from the time of Saul and you'd say, what do you call the person that goes to inquire of God? They'd say, a Navi. A Navi, that's what you call them? Yeah, a prophet, a Navi. But they weren't always called Navi. It's only recently that they're called Navi. During the monarchy period, we've called them Navi. But prior, we called them the Roe, the one who sees. So what does that mean to me if I'm looking at the text? It means that this reflects a later update. It reflects being updated to Navi when Avraham would have probably, based on this text and others that I'll quickly give you references to, when anciently he would have been called a Roe, a seer. Okay? Now, otherwise, we have to dismiss too many things. So, for instance, look these up on your own. I'm going to give you some of these verses. 1 Chronicles 9:22, 1 Chronicles 26:28, 2 Chronicles 16:7 and 10. These verses show that even in the monarchy period, there was some overlap, that they were calling them seers, sometimes Navi. The word Navi creeps in. So this is at least a later update in calling him a Navi. All right, you follow that? But I'm going to discuss that. I just wanted to bring it up because it's in chapter 20 in this interesting year of Abraham's life. But when I get to Exodus chapter 7 or twice in the book of Numbers, when we get to that, when we're doing that in the annual cycle of readings, or Deuteronomy chapter 13, Deuteronomy chapter 18, I'll really explore why do those texts in the Pentateuch use Navi and not seer. We'll talk about that. Okay, chapter 21, we finally get to the birth of the promised child. But we also see that it creates a problem in the family, right? Because it's not just Sarah. This family, this household of Abraham includes Hagar and his son Ishmael. Notice the theophoric name with El. Ishmael. So he's got a son through Hagar, which was the Egyptian handmaid of Sarai. She gave him. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the problems that result make me compare two texts in the patriarchal story of Abraham. Now, in chapter 16, we have a similar story to what happens in chapter 21. You can decide why that is, but let me give you a couple of the high points. In Genesis 16, Sarah is upset with Hagar, and Hagar's upset. There's a rift between the women. And Hagar, verses 6 and 7 of chapter 16, runs into the wilderness to get away. Well, guess what happens in chapter 21? Hagar, verse 14, runs into the wilderness because of the fight with Sarah. Interesting story. In chapter 16, you're going to have to draw this out. I don't want to flip back and forth and wear you out this morning. Chapter 16, verses 7 and 14, the story contains a well. There's a well there. All right. In chapter 21, in verse 19, there's a well of water. Very similar story. Hagar runs to the wilderness. She comes upon a well of water. All right. There's a fight between Sarah and Hagar. Now, here's where it gets interesting, is in chapter 16, she meets there the Malak. In chapter 21, she meets the Malak. But, ready? In chapter 16, it's the Malak Yehovah. In chapter 21, it's the Malak Elohim. Similar story, uses different details, and the deity, the way that the deity is referred to is different. Interesting. I'm just bringing up some observations from the text. The rabbis do this all the time. They did it for thousands of years. That's why we have so much Jewish literature. They're going, in this verse it says this, but this verse. Now, also in chapter 21, we meet again with Avimelech and Phicol. Now, once again, the Abrahamic story is similar to an Isaac story involving same or similar people. Now, you have to write this down. I know Baruch Perry's going to give us the notes, but I have to cover this, so I want you to write this down. The Abrahamic story that deals with Avimelech and Phicol is chapter 21, Genesis 21, verse 22 through 34. The Isaac story that deals with Isaac and Avimelech and Phicol is chapter 26, verse 26 through 31. Now, there's some interesting things here. In chapter 21, Abraham has an encounter with Avimelech and Phicol, and there is a story about the naming of Beersheba. Look at chapter 21, verse 25. Then Abraham approached Avimelech for the well of water which the servants of Avimelech had seized. Avimelech said, I don't know who did this. You did not tell me, nor have I heard of it until today. Abraham took sheep and oxen, gave them to Avimelech, and two of them made a pact or a covenant. Abraham then set 7 ewes of flocks by themselves, and Avimelech said to Abraham, what mean these 7 ewes which you've set apart? He said, you're to accept these 7 ewes from me as proof that I dug this well. Hence that place was called Beersheba, for there the two of them swore an oath. Okay, so they conclude the oath, Avimelech and Phicol, and so forth and so on. Now, go with me to chapter 26. I'm getting ahead a little bit just to show you this story. Verse 26. 26. And Avimelech came to him from Gerar with Ahuzat his counselor and Phicol, chief of the troops. And Isaac said to them, why have you come to me, seeing that you've been hostile to me and have driven me away from you? He said, we now see plainly that Jehovah has been with you, and we thought, let there be sworn a treaty between our two parties, between you and us. Let us make a pact or a covenant with you, that you will not do us harm, just as we have not molested you, but have always dealt kindly with you, and sent you away in peace. From now on, you be blessed of Jehovah. These are the people of Gerar, using the name. Then he made for them a feast, and they ate and drank. Early in the morning they exchanged oaths, right? Isaac then bade them farewell, and they departed from him in peace. That same day, Isaac's servants came and told him about the well they had dug, and said to him, we found water, and he named it Shiva. Therefore, the name of the city is Beersheba to this day. Now, what am I saying? Genesis 21, Abraham encounters Avimelech and Phicol. the name of Beersheba. We clearly have a reason for the naming of Beersheba in the time of Abraham. There is an oath, and it's the time of Abraham. Genesis 26, Isaac has an encounter with Avimelech and Phicol. It too is about a well. The naming of Beersheba comes in. It's a different story about the naming of Beersheba, but it does involve an oath. This time, it's in the time of Isaac. In Genesis 21, the name that is used for the deity is Elohim. Look at verse 22 and verse 23. You're going to have to go back and listen to this. I'm throwing a lot at you. Chapter 26, the name for the deity is Jehovah. Chapter 26, verse 24, 25, and 29. Interesting that we have these different sources which give us different historical accounts of how a name came to be. The beautiful thing is that we have inherited all of these sources from antiquity. Again, it's just like the book of Kings and Chronicles in that you have different sources which give us other details. Now we get to 22. In chapter 22, again, it's not real clear on the dating. We don't know, at least when we start. It just says, and after these things. It's one of the strangest stories in all of the Bible. The Elohim is going to test Avraham. Take your son, your only one whom you love. But is it his only son? Now, I know that people have theological ways to explain that, but just the facts, the textual detail. Your only son, the one you love, and kill him. He gets up early. Verse 3. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. Verse 5, he tells the other people there, we will come back. Again, theology comes in. People say he knew that God wouldn't make him do it. He knew they would come back. Two of them go together, verse 6. Now, verse 8, I want you to pay close attention to because it says, Elohim will see. Remember, Isaac asked the question, I see the rope, I see the knife, I see the, but where's the sacrifice? And he says, Elohim Yireh. God will see to himself for a sacrifice. Make a note. Chapter 22, verse 8 says, Elohim Yireh. Verse 9, the place that the Elohim, again, Elohim, Elohim. Verse 11 seems to interrupt the flow of the story, and I'm going to come back to that. Stay with me. Verse 16, look at verse 16. It says, because you've done this and have not withheld your son, the one you love. He says you didn't withhold your son. Verse 19, and Abraham then returned to his servants. Where's Isaac? Makes a big point. The two of them went together. We, the boy and I, will be back. We'll be back. We'll be back. But at the end of it, it says Abraham returned. No mention of Isaac. And then it says Abraham lived in Beersheba. You can see how some midrashic sources concluded that he actually did go through with it. Now, I know people are aghast at that. You're like, no way. But there's another piece that fits in here. Verse 11. 22, verse 11 through 16. Then the Malach Yehovah. Now remember, we've been using Elohim, 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 Elohim. The Malach Elohim called to him from heaven, Avraham, Avraham, and he answered, here am I. Don't raise your hand against the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you've not withheld your son, your favored one, from me. And Abraham looked up, his eye fell upon a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering in place of his son. And Abraham named that site Adonai Yireh. Now, this is interesting because here the name is used, whereas earlier in verse 8 of 22 it used Elohim Yireh. So some have concluded, this is just giving you full disclosure here, some have concluded that the story we now have in 22 is brought to us combining these different sources. Look, there is no doubt that there are some who believe that it went through with this deal with Isaac. Now, I don't, but I'm just telling you, some do. Isaac is instrumental in the story. We have to have him. So we have to have Isaac because it's through Isaac that we have Jacob and the tribes and the whole story. But the story does contain details from two different sources. They're combined to produce a single version that we now have. A careful review of the material we covered today raises many interesting points. We see that these observations are often missed because similar stories are not always right next to each other. Now, is it the case that chapter 17 and 18 reflect two different sources for the same story? Some would argue and say no, they're two, it's just like it is for a reason. But the details that I covered are very interesting observations that I want you to pay close attention to. When we look closely, what we can see is that the beautiful pieces that the ancient compiler used produce in the end like a beautiful quilt. Quilt with these different patches from the ancient world. A story from this source. It tells the story of Abraham and Sarah, and it uses consistently the name Elohim. We have another story of Abraham and Sarah doing the same thing, and it consistently uses the name Jehovah. And the compiler said, I want to preserve it all. And what we have is a collection of these ancient sources that the final compiler would dare not toss. And it becomes our task to look at the material and determine what are the traces of the earliest strata. As we open the book and we read it, we have to keep in mind, oh, this uses the name Jehovah, but it says that name wasn't known at that time. It's an update. It's okay. Oh, this calls the name of the place Beersheba. Where did the name Beersheba first come in? Well, some say, it's like you're sitting around a campfire and these old storytellers say, oh, there's a story that Abraham and Phicol and Avimelech, and they make a covenant, and somebody says, no, it wasn't Abraham, it was Isaac. It was Isaac and Avimelech. You're right, it was Avimelech and Phicol, but it wasn't Abraham, it was his son. Yeah, put them both. Thankfully, we have a sacred history that often provides more than one version of our story. At a very high level, this week, the long-awaited promised son Isaac is born. But we're not supposed to forget Ishmael. You know, much happened in a single year in the life of Abraham. It takes 14 chapters of Genesis to cover 175 years of Abraham's life. And 5 of the 14 are spent on a single year. 0.5% of Abraham's life is in 5 chapters. I attempted to do justice to that most significant year in the life of Abraham, and I want you to know that I know that you know that I'm covering some things which might be a bit challenging. But the reason I'm doing this is for a purpose. I want us to go through and identify the different sources and layers, because by doing that, over time, we'll be able to recognize the different hands that go in to these stories that we love and cherish so much. Don't throw anything out. That's not what I'm doing. I'm identifying the hands of the authors. The Bible in the hands of its creators. How did we get this book that we all seek to live our life by? What is the earliest record? And that's what we're searching for. So the life of Abraham is not yet over. We will conclude our Life of Abraham mini-series next week. Don't miss it. Join me Saturday morning, 10:30 a.m. Central Time on Facebook or YouTube. Shabbat Shalom, Shavua Tov.